Dr. Stephen Angle, on behalf of the Baldwin brothers, Ian and Michael, and Philip Baldwin, and the Marian Institute, welcome to the Three Brothers Quest.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Very good to have you as well. Can we just start, Steve, with a broad definition of Neo-Confucianism? Many of our listeners and viewers may be familiar with Confucianism, going back to its roots in ancient China. What is Neo-Confucianism?
Yeah, right. So the tradition gets going, as you said, in ancient China, and often what we refer to that early period of the tradition as is classical Confucianism, and that's probably the period of up to, I don't know, about 200 BCE, and then uh, Confucianism gets pulled into imperial ideology as the early Chinese empires are founded. And there's a sense in which Confucianism honestly gets more boring. It's philosophically creative initially, and that doesn't go away, but it becomes more scholastic, more the sort of thing that's caught up with narrow scholarship and imperial ideology, but not so much with kind of creative thinking. And that's partly because around the same time, Buddhism comes to China. And so for a lot of folks who are sort of intellectually or spiritually seeking something, Buddhism becomes the place to land, as well as various developments that are happening within Taoist thinking and Taoist religion. And that's the kind of status quo for about 1,000 years. It's it's the beginning of the Song dynasty or the end of the Tang dynasty, so roughly 1,000 CE, when a broad intellectual, philosophical, spiritual revival of Confucianism gets going. And this is Confucianism in a way that is now kind of a mashup with Buddhism and Taoism, and so has some new questions to go with the old ones, new terminology to go with the old ones, and that is the beginnings of Neo-Confucianism. So really, from around 1,000 CE down to at least the 18th or 19th century, that's this sort of new tradition of Confucianism.
So, from scholastic snooze fest to revival.
Right, exactly. And really, in many ways, a sort of a religious revival. A lot of individual kind of spiritual enthusiasm and seeking. Right. One of the core ideas I'm sure we'll talk more about is the idea that any individual can become a sage, and that's very core for Neo-Confucians, much more so than it had been for the classical tradition.
Yes, we'll come around to Sagehood momentarily. I wanted to mention, on behalf of the brothers, our introduction to Neo-Confucianism came through the work of Jeremy Lent, the author and integrator, whose beautiful books, The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning, brought Neo-Confucianism to our attention. And Jeremy writes, uh, and I'll paraphrase here, Neo-Confucianism integrates elements of the three great streams of Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, in what Lent calls a triumphant synthesis. It sounds like you would agree with that. You want to elaborate a bit?
Yeah, so I think that, in broad strokes, that's right. The Whether it's triumphant or not, certainly some of the Neo-Confucians themselves were pretty proud of themselves, and that is maybe an accurate self-description for some. Others were a little more humble about what was going on. The relations between those three teachings is a complicated matter. I think already in the Tang Dynasty, which is roughly 600 to 900 CE, you get quite a lot of back and forth. You have Buddhist monks who are reading Confucian texts and commenting on them. You have Taoist priests interested in Buddhism and Confucianism. The people don't always very clearly identify as whether they're a card carrying X or Y, right? Obviously, if you're a a Buddhist monk, then you do identify in a certain way, but Confucians much less so. So it's a really fascinating time of intellectual ferment. But yeah, out of that, we get the synthesis. I think that's right. For those who identify themselves as Neo-Confucians, they very much think of themselves as Confucians first, and sometimes are very critical of Buddhists and Taoists. So that's another element of this, even as they're drawing in certain ways on what the Buddhists and Taoists were up to.
Oh, that's so helpful. And before we get into maybe core Neo-Confucian concepts, notions, just to push on this a little bit more, Ian, one of the brothers, reminded the four of us that, for example, um, uh, Buddhism was troubling to many Chinese because of its emphasis on the notion of nothingness, if you will. Um, and I'm simplifying, but could you maybe say a word about why Neo-Confucianism emerged as a response to maybe perceived not weaknesses, but lacks maybe in the three isms we've mentioned?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a super important aspect to this, both in terms of ideas, but also in terms of sort of institutions, practices on the ground,
Mm.
right? So at the center of Chinese civilization is the idea of the family, right? And, a key Confucian virtue throughout the tradition is the sort of filial piety, the love and respect that one is expected to have for elders. That isn't about just unthinking obedience or anything like that, right? That's a whole other conversation. But the fact that our existence is within a family, and that a family writ large is perhaps how we should even think about society, even our relations to the cosmos, right? That's very, very core Confucianism. And at least at a superficial level, and maybe at a deep level, Buddhism rejects that, right? To become a Buddhist monk is to leave the family, right? In Chinese, it's literally 出家, right? To go out of the family and to become part of a new community, a monastic community. And so that was, from early days, that was a tension between, you know, you could say Confucianism, but it's really even probably more broadly just kind of Chinese culture uh, and uh, and Buddhism. So that's navigated in a lot of interesting ways. Right? Chinese Buddhists come up with narratives about the way in which a broader kind of filial piety is to be devoted to, the awakening of all, and so on and so forth. Um, uh, but that tension is there throughout. And I think in terms of the question of nothingness, one of the really interesting comparisons between Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism is that they use some of the same terminology, but for the Buddhists, there's no right answer that we can be confident of in a certain sense, right? The idea is, well, everything is equally interconnected, and there's no self, there's no answer that we can discover other than by kind of peeling away, becoming no longer attached, and so on, and then perhaps something emerges, right? We it's not like we don't do anything,
Mm.
but for the Neo-Confucians, they really worried about a kind of antinomianism, just the idea that there are no values, and because they think that values are real, and that there is a best way to be in the world, and so they would say, even setting aside these crazy Buddhist ideas about leaving the family, they have these, that's undergirded by a problematic philosophical idea that we don't have real love and responsibility to specific other people.
What about Taoism?
So, good question. And like all these things, Taoism's complicated. Buddhism is complicated. Anything I try to say about Buddhism is going to be some kind of, um, uh, you know, approximation that isn't true of some schools of Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say that the story with Taoism is still more complicated. The the Taoism that I have always found most fascinating is the Taoism that I associate most directly with the ancient text Zhuangzi. And Zhuangzi becomes very influential on certain developments in Chinese Buddhism, right? So you have stuff going on within sort of self-identified Taoist religious sects and so on. But you also have, I think, actually more profound philosophical ideas that are carried on within, say, Chan or Zen Buddhism and other strands of Buddhism that connect very strongly to early Taoism. So it's a complicated mashup of all this different stuff.
And I think we in the West, Steve, we forget how ancient China is. As I spent 10 years living and working across China, and as my Chinese friends were fond of reminding me, we've been around a long time, Rob.
Yes, right, right, right,
Well,
right.
and at the risk of complicating matters just a little bit more before we get conceptual, I'm going to hold up your wonderful book, Neo-Confucianism, A Philosophical Introduction, which you co-wrote with your colleague, Justin, is it Tywald? Tywald?
T-Wald, yep.
Tywald. And I've heard both of you on several podcasts hold forth as Westerners deeply interested in Neo-Confucianism. Can you just say a word about how you as a Westerner became embroiled in Neo-Confucianism, and maybe more broadly, Steve, what relevance does Neo-Confucianism have for us in the West today? And I know we're going to unpack that, but maybe begin with your own journey.
Yeah, sure. Uh, so there, my parents were not missionaries. An
Yeah.
earlier generation, that's how you got into it. But for me, it was randomly walking into a college class my first year in college, and becoming fascinated by China. Initially, it was a course on modern Chinese history, and that uh, that then led me to start studying Chinese, to study abroad in China, and so on. And at the same time, I had been taking courses in Western philosophy, which also was new to me in college. Started with Plato and Aristotle, and I think that had I been a student today, I would have double majored in philosophy. That wasn't so much a thing back in the day. And so I majored just in East Asian studies, but I took a lot of philosophy classes, all Western philosophy. And by the time I was a senior in college, I think it was becoming clearer to me that while I was really fascinated by Confucianism, so the sort of the intellectual history side of my East Asian studies was the thing that drew me the most. I was a little unsatisfied with, sorry to say this, Rob, I know you're a historian, but with what I saw as the limits of the historical approach uh, to these uh, to these texts, to these traditions, because with in my Western philosophy classes, we weren't just trying to understand and unpack and interpret these early texts. We were also asking questions of them, crudely, is this right? Right? Did Plato get it right? And that kind of critical engagement with the ideas was the thing that excited me the most. And so what I ended up deciding to do was going on and wanting to study Confucianism philosophically. And I was particularly drawn to Neo-Confucianism, I think, really because it is it's more explicitly systematically articulated in terms of its concepts than early Confucianism. And some of those questions really were the ones that drew me.
And isn't it curious, Steve, that your Western philosophical immersion began with Plato, even though the pre-Socratic Greeks, I'm thinking of Heraclitus or Empedocles, or they were very Eastern
Uh-huh.
in the sense of some of the same themes emerge. And we can put that aside for now, but it's so curious to me that you were running these two philosophical systems in parallel. Um,
Yeah, no, uh, I think the starting point was somewhat random. Um, uh, but the other thing I'll say, and this maybe gets a little bit to your question about the significance of some of these things, is I've ended up spending a lot of time in China. And so, a semester my junior year, and then a year in Taiwan after I graduated from college. I've lived in Beijing for a year, two different times, and made, I don't know, probably not literally countless, but certainly a lot of visits, including I'm headed back to Taiwan next week. And the that has meant not just an interest in the ideas, right? Because as a philosopher, it's not that I have to go and unpack some text in an archive somewhere. We pretty much all we know what the texts are. The question is, what the heck do they mean? And so the reason I spent so much time in China is because I think that I find it quite compelling the way in which questions about the relevance of Chinese traditions, Confucianism, and so on are such live options, are such complicated questions, politically complicated, socially complicated, uh, in in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, different sorts of Sinitic societies, where the 20th and 21st centuries have been really complicated over there. And so engaging with folks for whom these are life questions, these are not, as it were, just academic questions, is something that has been, I think, both fascinating but also personally meaningful. Because the more I work on this stuff, the more the question of, well, am I a Confucian, started to be pressing for me,
well,
right?
I hope we can circle back around to that question. And
Yeah.
just by way of example, I heard you say on a podcast in conversation with a young Chinese scholar, she said, we've seen such stupendous material wealth accumulation in China over the past few decades that across Zhongguo, across China, there is this sense that we have a deep spiritual crisis on our hands. And so Neo-Confucianism, it seems to me, Steve, for maybe not just Westerners who are fascinated with its living tradition, but also Chinese themselves, obviously today, there's a real search for meaning in Neo-Confucian tradition, it seems.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It is a fascinating, complicated, contested set of questions. And I've ended up, so one way of thinking about the Confucian tradition as a whole is you got classical Confucianism, which I mentioned. You have sort of this imperial Confucianism, the millennia of that. You have Neo-Confucianism. And then it ends up being pretty relevant to mark another stage of development once we get into the 20th century, when some of the main conversation partners for Confucian thinkers in the 20th century become people like Hegel and Kant,
Mm.
which, that leads to a new set of questions, big questions about democracy, which it was always monarchy. The entire history of the tradition, which, as you said, is ancient, uh, but still, the political imagination was was somewhat constrained by reality. So the 20th and 21st century Confucianism builds in many ways very directly on Neo-Confucianism, but has new sorts of questions and trajectories also.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And I hope we'll come around in just a few minutes to exploring Neo-Confucianism's connections with quantum physics,
Mhm.
fractal mathematics, et cetera. But before that, maybe let's get conceptual, Steve. Where where's the best place to begin in terms of a conceptual understanding of Neo-Confucianism? My temptation is to go with Li, this notion of pattern with a capital P, but you're take us on this conceptual journey for a bit.
Yeah, sure. And I think that that is where we should begin, but as a sort of caveat at the beginning, I think it's important to say that what the Neo-Confucian thinkers cared most about was individual and social moral growth. And so it's not, even though so Jushi, one of the greats of the tradition who lived in the 12th century, he edited a collection of writings by earlier Neo-Confucians, and really kind of that put his stamp on kind of like the curriculum for what it would be to learn Neo-Confucianism. And he starts with pattern with Li. So he starts with these big metaphysical concepts, but it would be a misunderstanding to think that he is first and foremost a metaphysician, right? He is first and foremost a sort of an ethical teacher who is aimed at promoting the cultivation of his students, and ultimately his writings are extraordinarily influential throughout China for many hundreds of years, and they're at the core of the educational system. So that's what he would care about most. But he does then kind of drill down and drill down and drill down and drill down, and what he finds as the thing that helps to unify the educational teachings and the moral concerns and so on is ultimately something like pattern, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, what is meant by pattern?
So I think it's helpful to think about what the sort of the earliest meanings of this word were. And the so two examples. One is if you think about a piece of jade, sort of an uncut piece of jade. There are apparently, I haven't spent a lot of time with uncut pieces of jade, but apparently there are sort of very faint, I don't know, little fissures within that piece of jade, little micro cracks, which if you want to then carve that into something, a beautiful pendant or whatever, you have to take those into account, right? So you have to carve with the sort of the implicit structuring of that piece of jade, which looks like a whole thing, but it's not, in mind. And those were called li, right? So those little veins in the jade or micro fissures in the jade. Um, Another thing that was called li early on were the sort of topological facts about an area of land that if you wanted to farm it, you needed to take into account, right? You think of like the terraces and so on. This is before rice farming actually, but it's most easy to imagine kind of terraced rice farms where in order to render land arable, you've got to react to it in a certain way, right? You can't just say clear cut everything. At least that wasn't the image. So from the beginning, this word was meant to refer to something that, uh, in a certain sense, was a fact about the way the world or nature or the cosmos was, but it was a fact that had a kind of a normative significance of value to humans. So there's a sort of a subjectivity and an objectivity, right? So airability or carvability or whatever we want to say for jade. That's the metaphor that they're working with, right? And then sort of take that and inflate it to sort of maximal metaphysical significance, right? Think of the cosmos as sort of potentially arable. That is, how can everything in the cosmos fit together in the most valuable way? And that would be what often is called the cosmic pattern. So, right, so that everything uh, has a place. It's a dynamic, not static idea, because it is supposed to be like, how do things fit together so that they are most generative of life? That's another key notion.
Yeah, and this it seems to align so beautifully with my understandings anyway, limited as they are of Taoism. This
Sure.
this notion of, for lack of a better term, cosmic flow, and
Yeah.
wondering if maybe we go from this notion of Li to this notion of Qi,
Mhm.
which you and Justin define in your book as vital stuff. And
Right.
I've come through Qigong practice to understand the notion of Qi as life force energy,
Mhm.
loosely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and maybe even before talking about Qi, we can dwell for another moment on the Taoist connection and the notion of sort of life and generativity,
Mm.
because the this is another case where we're talking about Neo-Confucianism, but we're also talking about, in a certain sense, pan-Chinese ideas. So, of course, you know about the Book of Changes, right? The I Ching, and that's a text that also has its own long, complicated history. It's and it's claimed by everybody. It is one of the core texts for the Neo-Confucians, and particularly the whole cosmology of the Book of Changes, but particularly there's a very, very famous commentary called the Great Commentary on the Book of Changes that has become incorporated into it. One thinks of it as a important part of the text, and that commentary is the origin of the phrase that what the cosmic changes are is endless generativity, endless life-giving generativity, and so when the Neo-Confucians are trying to unpack how it is that things fit together, right? This notion of Li, which is a sense of there's a kind of intelligibility. We can come to understand how things fit together, but also value and so on and so forth. Um, if you push them to say, well, what really is it that causes things to hang together? They're going to say it's the way in which the patterned changes of the cosmos generate life. Right? And so that notion of life is super important. Parenthetically, there's also another sort of Buddhist tie-in here, um, uh, where one of the core Buddhist teachings is that that life is suffering, right? This is one of the noble truths, and the Confucians want to deny that. Now the Buddhists are going to reply, "Well, no, we don't exactly mean what that thing that you're denying or whatever." But that's another other conversation. But the Confucians really want to say that correctly understood and correctly pursued, life is something that brings us joy. It is about a in a way a co-life with everyone else and everything in the cosmos, um, uh, and we are part of this uh, constant um, flow of dynamic changes, right? So that then brings us to Qi, and the the earliest meaning of Qi is breath, but by the time of the Neo-Confucians, long before, but certainly by the time of the Neo-Confucians, it was commonplace if we're going to think about what is the stuff that makes up the cosmos, or what is anything, in fact, that you could sense, you could touch, you could see, you could feel, etc. Right? Anything that is sensible is Qi. So the a kind of anachronistic modern rendition of Qi might be something like matter energy, right?
Or my mind.
And yeah, right. And so it's not a terrible way to think of Qi. I think that it imports a bunch of ideas that wouldn't have been in Juxi's mind when he was talking about that in the 12th century. And so it's it's a little tricky to use it as a straight translation, you know, as you know, if he had only lived a little bit longer, he would have thought of E equals MC squared or something, right? That's not that's the problem with an anachronistic translation like that. But it is very much something like that idea of the kind of the dynamic everything that makes up the cosmos, right? And the so not just matter that you touch, but also our our psychology is something that we understand through chi, right? And because that's obviously also something that you feel. You feel angry, right? That's a matter of your chi makeup. So if you have, or if one happens to have a particularly irascible disposition, right? You're easy to anger. That's a matter of your chi, right? And so chi is very important, both from the kind of metaphysical perspective, but also ultimately from the self-cultivational perspective, because while pattern is fixed, it's super complicated. This gigantic network of independent interdependencies that ultimately structures the cosmos. We don't change pattern according to just about anybody. What we have to change is our psychophysical makeup, our chi.
I keep coming back to this word you used just a few moments ago, Steve. Anything that is sensible.
Hmm.
And it's funny in English, when we hear the word sensible, we tend to render it as meaning, somebody who has common sense, but
Hmm.
sense in a much broader, energetic sense of that word sensible, which is really beautifully described. You lay out in your book, and I don't want to jump us ahead, but I'm seeing emotions in knowing, I'm seeing
Yep.
heart, mind, and I'm seeing nature. And I'm wondering if we look at the chi li flow, if you will,
Right. Right.
where those three, they seem very core concepts in Neo-Confucianism. You devote a chapter to each of those. In
Mhm.
where would we pivot to from Li and Chi?
So let's imagine we are Neo-Confucian philosophers, and we have this idea that there is a sort of a best way to be. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that's not a sort of a rigid static thing. What they really have in mind is there is a best way to respond to every situation that you find yourself in. So your kind of dynamic presence in a dynamic world as a best path forward. Whether that's uh, interpersonal, right, responding to some situation that arises with another person, or whether that's more with respect to an environmental issue or a political issue or so on. There's a way to navigate that is the perfectly apt response to each situation. So that's out there kind of abstractly, whether it's to be discovered or how that works is a big philosophical question. Um, and the so we have that idea, right? There's a sort of objective rightness, but then we also recognize that our sort of material, psychomaterial makeup, our chi, is imperfect, right? None of us are responding perfectly aptly to the situations that we encounter. We do a pretty good job, a lot of the time, um, but we screw up a lot. And so, why, right? Why is it the case that there is this perfect aptness, but there's also the reality of our sort of stumbling through life? And so trying to figure that out, trying to make sense of that, and try to then explain how it is we could come to get things right. That's really the work of that pair or that triad of concepts that you referenced. Um, so how does Li relate to our chi, right? So we've got this sort of imperfect chi, a perfect Li, how could they come together? And so briefly, the the answer that Neo-Confucians tend to give is, well, our nature is the Li that is in us somehow, whatever that in means, right? Um, and our emotions are our responses. So they tend to focus not so much on the physical actions we take, but on the emotional reactions that uh, that in a way come first, right? So uh, if you let's imagine you had a bad day at work, you come home, you're a grumpy mood, um, and your spouse says something which is probably innocuous, but you feel this angry response coming up. You manage to suppress it, right? So you don't actually, yell at them or something like that. And so your physical actions have been fine. The Neo-Confucians would still say that's deeply problematic, right? The goal is that you actually respond aptly in this emotional sense, and if you can kind of uh, just suppress it at the last moment, well, it's better than not suppressing it at the last moment, but that's not the goal, right? So, so emotions are what matters, right? We want to try to get the emotional responses right. If we do that, then we're on our way. So we've got nature in us. We have emotional responses that are happening, and because they are um, shaped by our psychophysical reality, our chi, they're often problematic. How do we get those to line up? Well, the work is somehow done by our heart mind, right? By the shin, right? Because the heart mind is the place where somehow the nature and the emotions have to encounter one another. And it's worth saying as you know that this word shin is, I think, one of the coolest ideas in Chinese thinking. It refers to you can't quite see, right, but the organ that's here, right, the heart, but it is the seat of thinking as well as feeling. And what Justin and I in our book try to do to really bring that home is to translate it not as heart, which some people do, not as mind, which some people do, and not even as heart hyphen mind, but as heart mind, one word, no space, no hyphen, because all the sorts of reactions, in fact, the things that I've been calling emotions, are both affective, felt, and cognitive, right? So they're married together. It's not like there's two separate things that are going on. So the philosophical question then is, well, how does that all work, right? But that's the setup.
Amazing. And I'm thinking about, what recent scientific discoveries have to say about heart mind in
Yeah.
the Western, until recently, Newtonian kind of mechanistic, some would say reductionist, materialist scientific paradigm versus the picture you just painted so beautifully about heart mind and the way heart mind seeks to align um, Lee with Chi, perhaps, and balance.
There are so many fascinating resonances with cognitive science. The A lot of work that's been done about looking at the affective origins of consciousness, for example, right? We've tended to think of consciousness as this cognitive thing, but it turns out, right, lots of evidence, very, very fruitful to sort of turn that idea on its head and look at the affective connections that we have to our environments, to other people, and so on and so forth, as really foundational to what it is to be conscious. So that is something that is extremely congenial to a Neo-Confucian thinker.
It sure seems that way. Before we go on to sagehood, knowing.
Hmm, right. So I mean, speaking of, I've been working for I guess I had a sabbatical that I spent in Taiwan a couple of years ago, and that out of that came a collaboration with a scholar based in Taiwan, uh, who also specializes in Neo-Confucianism, and he and I have been working on a number of projects. But one of them is a paper that is actually called Affective Knowing. And so it's focused on a different Neo-Confucian thinker, Wang Yangming, who is, another of the greats of the tradition, lived a little bit later than Zhu Xi. And his core concept is something that's a sort of a literal translation would be good knowing. Um, uh, and it is something that a lot of interpreters, both writing in Chinese and writing in English and other languages, because knowing is it. I mean, it's literally in the word, right? People tend to understand it along the lines that one would most naturally think about knowing, right? Knowing facts as a cognitive kind of thing. But it's super clear that that's not really well. Anyway, I claim it's super clear. So my collaborator and I think we have plenty of evidence that that's not what Wang Yongming had in mind, and that it really is about the kind of sort of primordial affective connection that we have. Wang Yongming goes even further than Zhu Xi, at least in terms of what he says explicitly. So he really centers the idea that we form one body with all things. He thinks that part of this affective sort of core relationality is not just feeling badly when other people suffer, but feeling badly when animals or plants or even non-conscious aspects of the environment are kind of broken or not following their nature, if you will, right? And so there's this deep kind of ecological consciousness that one can find. Wang, like some other Neo-Confucians, would talk about the would use sort of metaphors of family to talk about the ways in which our the sort of the heaven and earth, the cosmos,
Yeah,
can be thought of as our father and mother, right? And so we're children of the cosmos, if you will, which tells you something about how we should be relating to the environment outside of our bodies.
it's so interesting, Steve, because I'm going to guess that most Westerners who have a clue about Confucianism will see none of this in their own kind of perceptions of what they imagine Confucianism to be, and yet here we are. I mean, it does feel very cosmic. Um, and
It does. I mean, one of the tricks is that you might think that somebody who emphasized that we are the children of the cosmos and so on and so forth would end up being a big environmental activist, and that turned out not to be the case. So the one way to narrate the history of China is through in sort of ecological devastation and deforestation and so on and so forth. Right? Once upon a time there were elephants up in northern China, and roaming wild in the forests, and those forests are long gone. So that's in terms of thinking about the significance of this stuff. That's another kind of question to ask. That I think that there's great values and concepts, but we have to think about how they then play out in social settings, how they get connected up with politics, and so on and so forth, in order to really be able to grapple with the significance of a tradition like Neo-Confucianism.
yeah, beautifully said it. And maybe on that point, before we go to sagehood, how does the Communist Party, um, interface with Neo-Confucianism, if at all, in China?
So that's a great question. And the if you'd asked that question 30 years ago, even maybe 25 years ago, the answer would have been, well, just like it had been the case ever since the founding of the Communist Party in the early 20th century, the party is deeply, deeply critical of Confucianism, right? We have, of course, the Cultural Revolution, one of the centerpieces of which is back in the 60s and 70s. One of the centerpieces of which was to try to destroy traditional Chinese culture, which was seen as feudal and problematic in all sorts of ways, right? So that's most of the history of the Communist Party's interaction with Confucianism. In the last few decades, that's changed, at least rhetorically. And I think that so you started to get people talking about things like harmonious society and other kinds of Confucian sounding values in Chinese leadership. President Xi Jinping has talked a lot about Confucianism, about traditional Chinese culture, has put himself forward as an authority on the Confucian tradition. Right, you can get books in which you're instructed on how to understand Confucius's Analects from Xi Jinping. So there's a much tighter connection now. One of the reasons for this, I think this is a kind of a lot of scholars have made this point, is that as the economic growth as source of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party has slowed, has become less of a reliable legitimator, right? So we had decades and decades of amazing growth, right? Hundreds of millions of people being brought out of poverty and so on. So the Communist Party had a tremendous amount of goodwill as a result. As economic growth inevitably slows, then it's useful to have other sorts of legitimizers. And so, sort of standing up for Chinese civilization has become part of the story. But it is a complicated thing, right? So I mentioned harmony, harmonious society as a one of the first big slogans that the Communist Party began employing that resonated with Confucianism. For Confucius, harmony means complementary difference, right? And he explicitly contrasts it with uniformity. If you're a yes man, if you're just telling the leaders whatever they want to hear, you are not harmonious. 100% explicit in the early Confucian tradition and all Confucians since then. That difference between harmony and uniformity is not a difference that the Communist Party likes. And so when they say harmony, they mean uniformity.
Yeah.
Right? They mean the party line. And that it's very dangerous for Confucianism to, as it were, ally itself with the folks in power. This has been true for Confucianism for its entire history. That not having, right, there's no hope of Confucianism. There's no independent institution that can push back against the temporal authorities and what they claim. Right? It's rather, right, the route to success and power as a Confucian in traditional Chinese society was through the civil service examination system to become a government minister and so on and so forth. Right? So you're already co-opted in a certain sense. And so that dynamic continues to be complicated.
Yeah, and that was so well elucidated, Steve. My sense from being on the ground in China as Xi Jinping was coming into power and beginning his rise was, yeah, this is complicated. When they say harmony, they don't really mean what we think of as harmony, perhaps in the West, but I'm sure
Well,
that.
I would say
Yeah.
partly, we don't tend to talk about harmony quite as much in the West. And one could, we could talk about how does, Greek notions of harmony relate to Chinese notions of harmony or what have you. But I think that in the first instance, what's most significant is that the harmony that's being talked about from the sort of through government mouthpieces is not the harmony that Confucians would recognize.
Yes. Uniformity versus as you described. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, two last topics, sagehood,
Yep.
then maybe connections back to the West. And I heard you said say, and it might have been in the book, that Neo-Confucianism suggests that each one of us as humans has the potential to become a sage. So let me take a crack at this. If I recognize Li, the cosmic,
Hmm.
and I embrace Qi, life force energy, all that is sensible, I love this.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I learn how to use heart mind to navigate the alignment between nature. You define Li, which is in us,
Hmm.
and our emotions, my
Right.
emotions. Am I on my way to sage?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yes. Conceptually, that's what you're up to. And it turns out that it takes a lot of work. And it takes a lot of work in the first instance because, well, there's two ways to look at it. One is that our chi is imbalanced or muddied, or there's different metaphors that they use, but that is we can flesh that out in I think really easy everyday terms, uh, where we think about prejudice, we think about different kinds of, whether it's sexism or racism, maybe in overt ways, or maybe just, certain kinds of perspectives that one grew up with, that you've never questioned, right? All of that is part of your chi, and the work of transforming your chi so that you can be open-minded in the right kind of way. Ultimately, and this is the other perspective. So there's like transforming your chi is one way to think about it. Getting rid of selfishness is the other way that Confucians think about it. And I think that, you know, what's the root of all evil as far as Neo-Confucians are concerned? It's selfishness. And selfishness is looking, is perceiving a situation, responding to a situation too narrowly, right? You're not taking everything into account. Li is ultimately all encompassing, right? Um, uh, and so if you, I don't know, go to the grocery store, buy, your chicken for dinner tonight, and don't take into account, don't notice, don't give proper weight to, let's say, how those chickens were raised, how they were slaughtered, what the process was of getting them shrink wrapped onto your grocery store shelf, then there's a certain amount of selfishness that's involved in that, right? And so the process of learning to, not just like sit there and reflect on everything, but to act in the world in a way that gives due weight to all of the relevant factors. That's what the Neo-Confucians want us to cultivate. And they they're there are a lot of ways they want us to do that. One of their key sources is reading stories about people who have done a good job, right? Reading stories about ancient sages and trying to find ways in which we can relate to that in our own lives. So the reading is a big thing, but also inner reflection, also paying attention as we go about our daily lives and trying to kind of pick out moments when you realize, at least retroactively, that okay, there was a little selfishness there. I can notice that. I can then reflect on that and work on it.
I ran across this notion in my Neo-Confucian immersion of reverential attention. Reverential attention. I love this idea, and it reminded me sort of the power of ritual. But I think it's a little bit different. Can you explain this notion of reverential attention?
Yeah. So those are both great topics. And I know we don't have a heck of a lot of time left. Um, the so reverential attention is very closely related to what I was just talking about. So the part of selfishness, part of the reasons that we end up being selfish, is when we're just not paying attention. And so being attentive, as I said, trying to train oneself to be attentive to all the stuff that's relevant. So one can be selfish by accident, just through laziness and so on, right? So the reverence side is that what it's not just like, I don't know, some authority telling you, pay attention. No, it's that the 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 way in which everything fits together in this harmoniously, maximally generative way is supposed to be something that draws us. That as we notice that, it fills us with joy, right? And so it is exciting. It feels good to um, uh, to recognize that there is this sense in which there is a sense in which we are part of something greater than just our narrow egoistic selves, right? And so having reverence for that thing, for that ultimately for a cosmic pattern, right? That's how reverence and attention come together. And one of the ways we train ourselves to do that is through rituals, right? And so these days, my favorite example is waiting in line, right? You're in line to get a coffee at Starbucks or wherever. And how do you do that? Right. So the most crudely, you don't cut in line, but doing that well, enacting the ritual of waiting in line with propriety, right? The way that a sage would, responding perfectly, aptly to every moment of that process isn't just about not cutting in line, right? It might be about smiling. It might, saying, okay, here I am. And, exchanging a look with your neighbor and, and so on and not huffing and puffing and looking at your watch or, what have you. Right. And that's part of attending to the situation you're in a way that's going to maximally generate kind of the sort of uh, harmony that we're after.
So I can reverentially attend, Steve, to waiting in line,
Yeah, absolutely.
drawing on everything we've talked about. That is a beautiful a beautiful example. I think every one of us listening and watching can relate to. I want to run this by you. This is just a Neo-Confucian moment I ran across in a text. I'm curious to get your reaction to it. I think it summarizes everything we've maybe explored here. It goes like this: Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother. And I, a small child, find myself placed intimately between them. What fills the universe, I regard as my body. What directs the universe, I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters. All things are my companions.
Zhangzai, right? The Western inscription. It's great. And I think you're right. It really does hold together a lot that we've been talking about. And, maybe, one final thing to say is we've been talking a lot about China and the relevance of Confucianism in China and so on and so forth. I think of this as very much a philosophy, a spirituality, whatever you want to call it, that is relevant around the world. So Confucius didn't think of himself as talking about just people from the state of Lu, right? That he lived in, right? He was talking about people. And Zhu Xi didn't think of himself as talking about, people in the Central Kingdom, right? Again, he was talking about people. And I think that every bit as much as we might imagine that an ancient Greek philosopher or a European philosopher or whomever similarly was making, universalist claims that are meant to speak to people all around the world. I think it's absolutely true for Neo-Confucianism as well, and that there are a lot of ways in which we can learn from Confucianism wherever we're situated.
Beautifully said. The book again is called Neo-Confucianism: A Philosophical Introduction, um, by Steve Engel, our guest, and Justin Tuwald. Stephen, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and special thanks to the Baldwin brothers, of course, Ian, Michael, and Philip Baldwin, and the Marion Institute. Steve, is there a website, or how do folks who are listening and watching maybe keep up with your work, which is voluminous?
That's a great question. I'm gonna have to look to see what the URL is, because there is one. Uh, I mean, you just Google me and you can find me easily enough. But the I guess it's SANGLE, so sangle.faculty.wesleyan.edu. I teach at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And if I can give one plug, the if folks are interested, where I would suggest they start is a book I wrote a few years ago called Growing Moral. Subtitle is A Confucian Guide to Life. So I'm thrilled, Rob, that you enjoyed the Neo-Confucianism book that Justin and I wrote, and we did our best to not make it impenetrable. But Growing Moral is really written explicitly for a broad audience, and it talks about a lot of the themes that we've been discussing.
Well, I can already hear the Baldwin brothers in my ear saying, "Ooh, let's get Steve back on to talk about it." So I hope we can do that. As we say in Mandarin, your Mandarin is better than mine, but 谢谢, thank you, and have a safe trip to Taiwan. And I hope we can speak again soon, Steve.
That would be lovely, Rob. Thank you so much, and thanks to the Baldwin brothers. This has really been a lot of fun
for us too. 谢谢. We'll talk soon.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Welcome to the Three Brothers Quest. We have in the requesting room the three brothers, Michael and Ian and Philip Baldwin, to reflect on Stephen Engel's Neo-Confucianism podcast. Gentlemen, welcome.
Welcome, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah. I had so much fun talking to Dr. Engel. Michael, kick us off.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually thought Dr. Engel was really eloquent and spoke beautifully and fluid. And you were great too, Rob. I'm slightly overwhelmed at the prospect of sort of unpacking the amount of information that goes into Neo-Confucianism and the various Chinese expressions with their English interpretations. And so, I think, as we all agree, the outcome of such a great interview is hopefully there's soon going to be part two, because there's a lot to unpack.
Oh dear.
There's a lot to
Frozen.
Frozen. And so what I thought I would start with is actually a statement that was written at the time because I thought it was so interesting, especially since I'm a student of Tibetan Buddhism, which basically my brothers are too, and Rob. And this whole notion of getting a little bit worked up about emptiness and objecting to that point of view. So I'm just going to read what this person said way back when. Buddhism looks upon emptiness as the highest and upon existence as an illusion. Those who wish to learn the true Tao must take good note of this. Daily we see the sun and moon revolving in the heavens, and the mountains and rivers rooted in the earth, while men and animals wander around the world. If 10,000 Buddhas were to appear all at once, they would not be able to destroy the world, to arrest its movements, or to bring it to nothingness. The sun has made day and the moon night. The mountains have stood firm and the rivers have flowed. Men and animals have been born since the beginning of time. These things have never changed, and one should rejoice that this is so. If one thing decays, another arises. My body will die, but mankind will go on. So all is not emptiness. So, of course, I think, what was triggered, I guess, by generating this Neo-Confucian thought or philosophy was largely to do with wait a minute, this emptiness thing is, forget it. You can't go there. And I think that is so fascinating because I think in this materialistic world that we're in, uh, believing that emptiness is indeed it is tough. It's very tough. So I thought I would just do that. Now, as I say, there's so many things to unpack, and some of the things that occur to me, and I know the brothers don't want to do quantum physics, and I'm not saying in any way that Neo-Confucianism is a synthesis of Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and quantum physics. But there is a very interesting, almost metaphorical way in which you can entertain, at least to play with, quantum physics. And it intrigues me that Einstein was rather interested, and especially the great scientist Niels Bohr was really interested in Neo-Confucianism. And for instance, when he won his Nobel and had to create a crest, it contained the yin and the yang. And so I just find that philosophy, well, just fascinating because it does embrace a great deal of this personal quest ability to go within and find, I suppose you would say, enlightenment, which is available to each of us with a little work. So, I mean, I can go on and on about sagehood and harmony, but not uniformity and the investigation of things and, the heart mind and the reverential attention, which you brought up, Rob. I mean, these are all rather fascinating aspects of Neo-Confucianism, but I'm being very general and broad, and I think I've blurted enough.
Mikey,
I'm done.
Mikey, um, more than any of us, you're a committed Buddhist. And how would you, because you got excited when we all read Jeffrey Lent's book, Patterning Instinct.
Sure.
And that's what put us on to Neo-Confucianism. None of us knew what it was, and perhaps we still don't. But what made you excited? What was new to you, coming from a Buddhist background?
Well, what was new? First of all, I mean, I have to say, I love this quote. This is a quote this is what I struggle with a bit in Buddhism, which is the last little bit, and this is tiny little quote. This is one of the great masters who came, I think, in the 16th or 15th century. I can't remember his name, but anyway, for a person to realize one's yin is to realize fully one's nature, and in so doing, one realizes heaven. Don't think too much. Now that where we go, we can What?
Stop the podcast right now.
Well, but and it takes me a little bit back to retort. And, that's what she says too. Buddhism is laced with thinking, so to speak. I mean, it's repetitive, mantra saying, visualization. It's so head. It's so headed. And what I think is so interesting about the Buddha is he sat under that tree. He was in nature, which is, of course, what run. What is it? What is it? Run toward.
Right, sorry.
Just get out in nature and understand this incredible interconnectivity that exists in nature. And the head trip versus the heart mind. And I love the way Stephen went. Don't do heart dash mind. This is one word. It hit me. It just hit me.
Mhm.
The bear. Goodbye.
So beautiful, Michael. Thank you.
I actually anticipated being at the end of the conversation. I would just add that Neo-Confucianism, I found it unbelievably compelling. Once again, thanks to Jeremy Lent's book, The Patterning Instinct, which is the source that brought us all to this subject. And why is it relevant now? If I could, I'm just going to read you two tiny little passages. What he's talking about, Zhang Zi, I think I'm saying that correctly. And what it rose in Zhang Zi was a sense of universal Ren, R-E-N, which is the sort of follow-on, wrap-up element of Neo-Confucianism. And it became, supposedly, one of the most influential statements in Chinese philosophy. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother.
Yeah.
And I, a small child, find myself placed intimately between them. What fills the universe, I regard as my body. What directs the universe, I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters. All things are my companions. Wait, that was 1,000 years ago. Flash forward to the 20th century. Albert Einstein. A human being, he wrote, is part of a whole called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest. Kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons near us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty.
And by the way, rude, Phyllis, because this is my concluding quote.
Well, there we are. We're all on the same page. How could
Totally.
you appreciate a way of being? I don't know quite what the Chinese would call Neo-Confucian. It's a philosophy for living. It's not a religion. But 1,000 years later, one of the greatest scientists of the era kind of said the same thing. So we're on to something good here with this Neo-Confucianism. You'll need to stay with it. So let's do a part 2 for sure and go deeper into this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I concur 100%.
Wow, so good.
You don't have to say anything, Ian.
Buster, throw us a few crumbs.
Well, I took on a little bit of Confucianism, and relative to Taoism, I was a Taoist. And I've just learned something called the Neo-Taoists or New Taoists. And I highly recommend we engage with both systems. What I like as new for me is this idea of attention. And the way Stephen concretized that in what he called a ritual. And so you think, ritual? No, we all are in rituals, whether we know it or not. The ritual he used was waiting in line, something we all do, at least used to.
Good one.
And he says, now, what is your attitude? And keep in mind what Philip just said and Michael said earlier, namely this phenomenon of Ren, universal consciousness. And one could get complicated, and I'm not able to get complicated, but it's in you, even if you don't know it. And as the Buddha was in nature all the time, I think the Buddha had a full experience of it, meaning connected to everything, which wires around, I think, to Bohr and the quantum, where things happen faster than the speed of light. So I like it very much because it took philosophy and brought it down into, we've all had that experience, and rarely do we remain calm and observant. We get irritated. And I think that's the heart of the Confucianist / Neo-Confucianist thing. Pay attention. Why are you irritated? And by asking that, you then see, oh, that's a young mother who's got a screaming child or whatever, or an old man who's making his utmost effort to stand without falling, etc. And for me, that was really helpful. It brought me into alignment with the endeavor.
Good.
It's good. Well put.
The very
The little analogies, they're incredibly good tools.
Yeah.
Standing in line is a brilliant one. I loathe standing in lines. But occasionally you can give in. You give in.
Yeah.
It's no problem.
Yeah, but it's a little more than giving in. If I understood him correctly, it's attending to all that's around you because it's all alive.
Well, I think giving in is the first step to going there.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think it's shedding selfishness, which is such a key factor in Neo-Confucianism. And then that wonderful, that reverential attention. And reverential, very key word.
Those last 10 or 15 minutes of the conversation.
Yeah, they were really good.
They were good. And they went to the heart of the matter, didn't they?
They did. He said, I think it was Stephen, probably he was quoting someone, selfishness is the root of evil.
Yeah.
Stop. End.
I also like
good.
I also like his word coherence. The coherence of all things. No, the guy's a gem. The guy.
May I be so bold as to say, let's go there. Let's invite him back.
Totally.
Now.
Yes.
Totally.
While they're still awake on this subject.
and let's be sure to share all of this with Jeffrey Lent and Jeremy, and ask him to do another interview with us because he has a book coming out and be interesting to interview him. We interviewed him 3 years ago. Yeah.
Maybe with Angle. I guess he wouldn't do that. I don't know.
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah, I know. You're right. Yeah.
I think Jeffrey. I don't know what he's done in his new book, but he's a
individual.
Covers the whole universe, and Stephen is a scholar and a practitioner, and on a subject, one subject.
Yeah.
But Jeremy's his recap or introduction to it was extremely good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, gentlemen, amazing reflections on what was such a powerful conversation with Dr. Stephen Engel, and I agreed we'll go invite him a second round, and appreciate you three. We want to also acknowledge and thank the Marian Institute for making Three Brothers Quest possible, and cannot wait to our next conversation.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Adios.
Adios. See you soon.